The gun hit the table before Ada Brooks even pulled her hand from her coat, and the sound of it cut through the saloon like a crack of thunder splitting open a cloudless sky. Every head turned. Every conversation died. The piano player in the corner let his fingers fall silent on the keys, and for one breathless moment, the entire town of Caldwell, Kansas held its breath and stared at the woman standing in the doorway of the Broken Spur Saloon with mud on her boots and fury in her eyes, and a truth burning on her tongue that she had carried for 600 miles and was no longer willing to swallow. "Ezra Holt," she said, her voice low and deadly and absolutely certain. "I know what you did to my father." The man at the center table, a broad-shouldered figure with silver at his temples and a sheriff's badge pinned to his chest that he had not earned through any act of justice, went very still. The two men flanking him reached for their holsters, and that was when Martin Yates moved. He had been sitting at the far corner table, the one nobody ever chose because it was pressed against the back wall, and the wood was warped from years of spilled whiskey, and the single candle on it guttered every time the door opened. He had been sitting there alone, as he sat every Friday evening, with a glass of rye he barely touched, and a silence around him that the other regulars had long since learned not to disturb. But he moved now, and he moved fast, placing himself between the two reaching hands and the woman in the doorway with a speed that seemed at odds with the quiet, contained stillness he normally carried. "Gentlemen," he said softly, and there was something in his tone that made both men freeze in a way that Ezra Holt's barked orders never quite managed. The moment cracked open. The moment spilled everything. And Ada Brooks, whose hands had not trembled until exactly now, felt her knees threaten to give way beneath her as she realized she was not, despite all her planning, entirely alone in this. She would not understand until much later, not until after the shouting and the accusations and the terrifying hour in the sheriff's back office, and the long walk through the dark Kansas night with a stranger who smelled of wood smoke and worn leather. She would not understand until much later that this moment in the Broken Spur Saloon was the beginning of something that would change her life far more profoundly than the secret she had ridden 600 miles to expose. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, and the truth, like all things worth knowing, requires its proper beginning. Ada Brooks had left St. Louis on a Wednesday morning in October of 1878, which was not a good morning for traveling, as the rain had been coming down since before dawn, and the Missouri Pacific platform was slick with it, and her trunk was heavy, and the porter who was supposed to help her with it had disappeared entirely. She was 26 years old, and she had spent the previous 4 months doing things that women of her station were not supposed to do. She had spent those 4 months reading through her dead father's correspondence, bribing a clerk at the Missouri Land Registry, riding a borrowed horse to 3 different counties to speak with men who had known Thomas Brooks before his death, and slowly, painstakingly, assembling a picture so ugly and so clear that she had not been able to sleep properly since she'd seen its full shape emerge from the evidence. Thomas Brooks had died 8 months ago. The official verdict was heart failure, which was plausible enough for a man of 53 who had worked hard his entire life. The unofficial verdict, the one that existed only in Ada's mind, and in the careful notes she kept in a small leather journal that she carried everywhere, was that her father had been slowly, deliberately, and systematically robbed of everything he owned by a man named Ezra Holt, who had leveraged false debt claims and forged land documents, and the particular kind of social pressure that came from wearing a badge in a small town. And that the stress and humiliation of watching his life's work dissolve around him had contributed directly to Thomas Brooks's death. This was not provable in any court that Ezra Holt's money could reach, which was every court within 200 miles of Caldwell, Kansas. But Ada had not come to Caldwell to use a court. She had come to stand in the middle of this town and say what she knew out loud, in front of witnesses, and to let Ezra Holt see that someone knew, that Thomas Brooks had a daughter who had not forgotten and would not be bought and could not be frightened away by two men in a saloon reaching for their guns. Or so she had thought, before the reaching actually started. The train to Caldwell had taken 3 days, with a transfer at Topeka that required a 4-hour wait in a station that smelled of coal smoke and unwashed travelers. Ada had sat on a wooden bench with her trunk between her feet and her journal in her lap, and gone over her notes one more time, not because she needed to. She had the facts memorized so thoroughly they played behind her eyes when she closed them, but because the act of reading them made her feel less like she was doing something reckless, and more like she was doing something necessary. Her seatmate on the final leg to Caldwell was a cattle buyer from Wichita named Harold who talked without stopping for 4 hours about the price of beef, and the unreliability of the Atchison line, and the changing landscape of the Kansas cattle trade. And Ada had nodded at intervals, and heard almost nothing of it because she was watching the flat brown land roll past the window and thinking about her father's hands. Thomas Brooks had had the kind of hands that showed his history. Broad and calloused from the years he'd spent working the land before he managed to buy it outright, and then later careful and ink-stained from the bookkeeping and the correspondence that came with owning a modest but productive piece of Kansas farmland. She had held those hands at his funeral and thought how wrong it was that they were so still. She arrived in Caldwell on a Saturday afternoon when the cattle pens at the edge of town were full, and the main street was loud with drovers and merchants, and the particular electric energy of a cattle town at the height of its season. She checked into Mrs. Haverson's boarding house, which was the only establishment in town that Mrs. Haverson's advertisement in the Caldwell Post had identified as offering respectable accommodation for ladies traveling alone, and she paid for 3 nights, which was what she had calculated she would need. That had been 2 days ago. The first day she had spent quietly, walking the town, getting a sense of it, watching the rhythms of who went where and when. Caldwell in 1878 was a working town, rough at its edges, with the particular mixture of permanent residents and transient cattle drovers that made it lively and unpredictable in equal measure. There was a church, 2 general stores, a land office, 3 saloons, a hotel that was grander than the boarding house, a livery stable, a barber, a doctor, and a sheriff's office with a jail attached, all strung along Main Street like beads on a wire. Ezra Holt's name was everywhere. His name was on the deed to the largest parcel of grazing land south of town, which Ada knew because she had stood at the window of the land office, pretending to inquire about homestead claims, while actually reading every visible document she could see from that angle. His name was mentioned in the approving, slightly deferential way of people who feared a man, and had decided to call that fear respect. He was the sheriff, had been for 3 years, long enough to have made himself indispensable and dangerous in roughly equal measure. On the second day, Ada had made the mistake of asking too many questions too quickly of a woman at the general store who had known her father before the land dispute, and by afternoon she had the uneasy feeling that her presence and her purpose were no longer entirely secret. That evening, sitting at Mrs. Haverson's dinner table, she had watched one of the sheriff's deputies walk slowly past the boarding house twice in an hour, and she had understood that she was running out of time, which was why she had gone to the Broken Spur on Saturday evening instead of waiting for the Monday morning town meeting she had originally planned to use as her moment, which was why she had walked in there with the gun on the table and the truth on her tongue and no particular plan beyond being heard. She had not planned for Martin Yates. Nobody in Caldwell ever seemed to plan for Martin Yates. He was simply there, in the way that certain fixtures of a town become invisible through familiarity: the church steeple, the water trough, the particular creak of the 3rd step at Mrs. Haverson's boarding house. He had come to Caldwell 2 years ago, and the story of why he'd come, like most true stories about people who showed up in frontier towns without family and without fanfare, was not the kind of story people told in public. What people knew about Martin Yates was this. He had a homestead of roughly 300 acres about 4 miles north of town, where he grew wheat on the flat land and kept a small herd of cattle on the rougher ground near the creek. He was competent with horses in the particular way of men who had spent time with them in circumstances beyond ordinary ranch work. He was quiet in a way that was not unfriendly, but was absolutely firm, the silence of a man who had decided what he would and would not say, and was not interested in renegotiating that decision. He was, by most estimates, somewhere in his early 30s, though the particular quality of stillness he carried made him seem ageless in the way that people who have survived something difficult sometimes do. He had a table at the Broken Spur that was considered his by unspoken agreement, the warped corner table that nobody else wanted, and he sat there on Friday evenings with his single glass of rye and read whatever book he'd borrowed from the traveling library wagon that came through Caldwell every 6 weeks. He did not talk much. He did not involve himself in other people's business. He had, to the knowledge of anyone in Caldwell, never once drawn the pistol he wore at his hip in any capacity other than the occasional rabbit or rattlesnake. Until Saturday evening, when Ada Brooks walked into the Broken Spur with a gun on the table and 2 of Ezra Holt's men reaching for their weapons, and Martin Yates stood up from the corner and placed himself between them. The thing that happened in the next 15 minutes was not a shootout, despite how close it came. It was, more precisely, a very tense negotiation conducted at extremely close range by people with weapons drawn and tempers elevated, and it ended with Ezra Holt standing up from his table and saying, in a voice that was careful and controlled in the way of a man who has decided that the better play is patience, that there was nothing to be settled here tonight, that Miss Brooks was clearly overwrought from her travels, and that he was sure everything could be discussed in a civilized manner in the morning. Which was, Ada recognized immediately, not agreement and not concession but a tactical withdrawal, and she recognized it because her father had written about this very quality of Holt's in a letter she had found folded inside his Bible. The man never fights a battle he might lose, and he never loses the ones he chooses. She had been escorted out of the Broken Spur by Martin Yates, which had not been her choice but had been, in the moment, the only sensible option, since the alternative was standing in the middle of the saloon until something worse happened. He walked her to the door and then outside into the cool October night, and for the first 30 seconds he said nothing, just walked beside her along the boardwalk in that particular contained way of his, and Ada, whose heart was still slamming against her ribs and whose hands she was only now realizing were shaking, said sharply, because she was frightened and frightened people are often sharp, "I did not ask for your help." "I know," he said. "I had a plan. It was a poor one." She stopped walking. He stopped too and turned to look at her, and in the lamplight from the saloon window she could see that he had gray eyes, the color of a sky before rain, and that they were looking at her with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite amusement, and was something she could not immediately name. "I know what Ezra Holt did," she said. "I have documentation. I have witnesses willing to speak. I came here to say it out loud where people could hear it." "Saying it out loud in the Broken Spur on a Saturday night," he said, "where Holt has 6 men and you have a single-shot Derringer is not a plan. It's a eulogy." She wanted to argue with him. She had the argument ready, had had it ready since St. Louis, but something in the plainness of his assessment stopped her, because it was not unkind and it was not dismissive. It was simply accurate, and she was tired enough and frightened enough that accuracy felt like a hand extended rather than a blow landed. "You know him," she said. "Most people in Caldwell know him," Martin said. "The ones who matter know what he is." "Then why has nothing been done?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she heard the whole complicated truth of small frontier towns and the men who controlled them, the way fear calcified into acceptance and acceptance calcified into something that looked, if you stood far enough back, almost like consent. "Because knowing what something is," he said finally, and being able to do something about it are not the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment. The night air was cold and smelled of cattle and wood smoke and the dry autumn grass of the Kansas plain, and somewhere down the street, a door opened and music spilled out and was swallowed again. "Ada Brooks," she said. "My father was Thomas Brooks. He owned land south of here until Ezra Holt took it." Something moved across his face, quick and complicated. "I know who Thomas Brooks was," he said. She felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of the particular tension that had been there since St. Louis, since long before St. Louis. "How?" "Come on," he said, not answering yet, already walking. "There's a diner 3 streets over that's still open. You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and I have something to tell you that you're going to need to be sitting down for." The diner was a small place, 4 tables in a narrow room, run by a woman named Clara who had the particular quality of efficient warmth that comes from years of feeding people in a hurry. Martin seemed to be known here, not in the saloon way of a regular who belonged to the place, but in the quieter way of a man who was simply a fixture of the neighborhood's life. Clara brought coffee and bread and cold beef and dried apple pie without being asked, and Martin sat down across from Ada at the table near the window, and for a moment he just looked at the steam rising from his coffee cup with an expression Ada was beginning to understand, was the face he wore when he was organizing something difficult. "You are the first person who has sat at this table and made it feel less empty," he said. She blinked. Of all the things she had been prepared for him to say, this was not among them. He seemed to hear himself then, and something flickered in his expression that might have been the ghost of embarrassment, but it was gone quickly and replaced by that steady gray steadiness. "I ate here alone for 2 years," he said. "I'm not sure why I said that. I apologize." "Don't," she said, and she was surprised by how much she meant it. They looked at each other across the small diner table, and the coffee steamed between them, and somewhere outside in the Caldwell night a horse stamped and a door creaked, and Ada Brooks felt something she had not expected to feel in this town, in this situation, on this errand of grief and justice and old rage. She felt the specific, bewildering, terrifying pull of a person she had not finished knowing. She set it aside. She was good at setting things aside. She had been setting things aside for 8 months. "Tell me what you know," she said. What Martin knew was this. 3 years ago, before Ezra Holt had managed to consolidate his grip on Caldwell's law enforcement, and through it, on the surrounding land dealings, there had been a loose confederation of small farmers and homesteaders south and east of town who had organized something like a cooperative, pooling resources for shared water access and collective bargaining with the cattle buyers. Thomas Brooks had been one of the founding members, and Martin Yates, who had arrived in Caldwell from somewhere he did not specify and had established his homestead quietly and quickly, had attended several of their meetings. He had seen Holt move on the cooperative from the beginning, had watched the pattern of forged debt claims and manipulated land surveys, and the particular strategic deployment of the sheriff's badge to make everything official enough that it was difficult to challenge. And he had tried to warn Thomas Brooks, who was a decent man and a trusting one, with the particular vulnerability of decent, trusting men. Thomas Brooks had not quite believed him, or rather had believed him but not quite believed that it could happen as completely as Martin feared it would, and by the time the full shape of Holt's scheme became clear, Thomas Brooks had already lost his best 40 acres and was in debt to Holt's associate at the land bank for the rest. "I should have done more," Martin said, and the way he said it was not the theatrical self-recrimination of a man seeking comfort. It was a simple, factual, load-bearing statement, the kind that said, "I have been living under this weight and I am telling you the truth of it." "What stopped you?" Ada asked. He was quiet for a moment, and she had enough sense now of how he moved through silences to understand this one was different, was heavier, was a door he was deciding whether to open. "I have a history with Ezra Holt," he said. "Not in Caldwell, before Caldwell. It's the reason I came here and the reason I have been careful about how I move." Careful, she said. You weren't careful tonight. No, he said. I wasn't. He looked at her across the table with those gray eyes that held the flat, considered weight of a man who has measured many things and learned to be accurate in his measurements. And Ada had the strange, specific feeling of being seen, which was different from being looked at and considerably rarer. What history? She said. He told her some of it. Not all of it, not yet, because some truths require time to be properly offered and properly received, but enough. Enough for Ada to understand that Martin Yates had come to Caldwell not by accident but by intention, that Ezra Holt's trail of fraudulent land dealings and official corruption had a longer history than Caldwell, that there was a county in eastern Kansas where a similar pattern had played out 5 years before, and that Martin had been connected to it in ways that were complicated and not entirely clean. You made a deal with him, Ada said slowly, watching his face. Once, he said. Before I understood what he was. I sold him land that I did not know had been fraudulently obtained in the first place, which meant that my transaction was, technically, part of the chain. He looked at the coffee cup. I have since understood the full shape of what I participated in. That understanding is not comfortable. Are you in danger if you move against him openly? I'm in a position where I can be discredited, he said. Holt knows this. It's why he has been, up to now, content to let me sit in my corner of the broken spur and not bother him. The deal we have, the unspoken one, is that I have what remains of my homestead because I stay quiet. Ada looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the night had deepened and the main street of Caldwell had grown quieter, the saloon noise reduced to a distant murmur, and the prairie darkness pressed up against the diner windows with its particular vast weight. And now you've stood up in the middle of his saloon and put yourself between him and a woman asking inconvenient questions, she said. Yes. That doesn't sound like a man who plans to stay quiet. No, he said again. I suppose it doesn't. She should have felt more cautious about this. She was an intelligent woman, and she knew the shape of hidden motives, knew that men who appeared at convenient moments in stories like this were not always what they presented. She had her father's careful instincts and her own 8 months of hard, solitary work, and she knew better than to let the particular gravity of gray eyes and honest speech pull her into a trust she hadn't earned yet. She was also bone-tired and the coffee was warm, and across this small table in this small diner in the middle of a cattle town on the Kansas plain, there was a man who had stood up for her in a saloon full of enemies and then told her the truth about his own complicated position without dressing it up or making himself the hero of it, and she found, despite everything, that she trusted him. Not completely. Not yet, but enough. I have documentation, she said. Copies of the original land surveys my father filed in 1871. A letter from a surveyor in Wichita who testified that the amended surveys on record in Caldwell were altered. 3 sworn statements from former members of the cooperative willing to say publicly what happened. And a letter from my father's lawyer in St. Louis that traces the debt forgeries. Martin went very still, in the way she was coming to recognize meant he was recalibrating. That's enough, he said quietly. If it reaches the right people. The Federal Land Commissioner's office in Topeka, Ada said. I have already written to them. They are expecting a formal complaint with supporting documentation within the month. He looked at her. You've been doing this for 8 months alone. My father didn't have anyone else. The diner was quiet. Clara had disappeared into the kitchen, and the only sound was the distant murmur of the town settling into its Saturday night, and the occasional pop and creak of the wood frame building adjusting to the cooling night air. I have things too, Martin said. Records I kept. The land survey discrepancy I noticed from my own parcel, which is adjacent to your father's original holding. Testimony I can give directly about the false debt instruments because I saw one prepared. Ada's breath stopped. You saw a forgery being prepared, she said carefully. I walked into Holt's land office 3 years ago with what I thought was a straightforward boundary question about my northern fence line, and I interrupted something I was not meant to see. I left quickly and pretended I had seen nothing, because at that point, I was still trying to understand whether what I'd glimpsed was what I thought it was. He paused. I have spent 2 years being absolutely certain and absolutely unable to act without destroying the careful neutrality that kept my land and my life intact. And now? And now Thomas Brooks's daughter has walked into the Broken Spur on a Saturday night with a derringer and 6 months of documented evidence, and it appears the period of careful neutrality is over. Ada felt something that was not quite a laugh rise in her chest. It didn't quite make it out, but it softened something in her face, and she saw him notice it, and she saw him react to it in a way that was very small and very human, a slight easing around his eyes, a barely visible adjustment in the line of his shoulders. "We need to move quickly," she said, because she was practical and this was practical. "If Holt understands what we have together, he will not wait. He already knows you're here and why. His men will report what happened tonight within the hour if they haven't already." Martin looked out the window at the dark street. "We have perhaps until morning before he decides what his response is. Then we need to get the documentation to Topeka before that response happens. The Monday stage runs north to Wichita. From Wichita you can reach Topeka by rail. That's 2 days. Yes, we need a faster option." He thought for a moment. "There's a man named Carver, Edgar Carver, who runs stock up to Wichita by horse relay 3 times a week. He leaves tomorrow at dawn. He's trustworthy and he owes me a favor." Ada was already thinking through the logistics. If Carver can carry the complete documentation package to Topeka directly, with a covering letter to the Federal Land Commissioner's office, and if we can keep Holt occupied and off balance here for long enough, "Ada," he said. She stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it was quiet and direct, and contained a kind of attention that she felt in the specific place behind her sternum where things that mattered tended to land. "How long has it been since you slept properly?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Not since St. Louis, and even then not well." "Then let's get the documentation together tonight, get it to Carver before dawn, and let you sleep before we face whatever tomorrow brings. Holt is careful. He won't move before he's thought it through. We have until morning." She wanted to argue, because she had been running on the fuel of urgency for so long that the suggestion of rest felt like a trap. But he was right. She could feel how right he was in the particular way her hands had steadied and her thoughts had started to blur at the edges, and she was too experienced at this particular brand of exhaustion to pretend it didn't matter. "All right," she said. He walked her back to Mrs. Haverson's boarding house, not because she needed to be walked anywhere but because the night was dark and Holt's men were somewhere in it, and when they reached the front steps he said, "I'll be here at 4 in the morning. Have everything you need ready." She looked up at him on the dark street, and the lamplight from Mrs. Haverson's parlor window fell across his face and made the gray of his eyes look almost gold, and she thought, "This is a man carrying something very heavy, very carefully, and he has been carrying it alone for a very long time." She knew what that felt like. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it without qualifications or complications. Something in his face did what faces do when unexpected kindness lands in unexpected places. Something brief and unguarded and very human. He nodded, and he was gone, and she went inside. She did not sleep. She sat at the small desk in her room and organized her documentation with the focused precision of a woman who had been trained by a meticulous father to do difficult things carefully. And she wrote a clear and thorough covering letter to the Federal Land Commissioner. And she made a second complete copy of the most critical documents to keep in her own possession. And by the time the clock on the wall showed 3:30, she had the package ready, tied with twine, sealed with wax, and addressed clearly. He was there at 4 exactly. He had his own documents in a leather satchel, the survey discrepancy notes, and the careful written account of what he had witnessed in Holt's office. And together they walked through the still, cold pre-dawn streets to Carver's stable at the north edge of town, where a lean man with sleepy eyes and a steady manner received the package, heard Martin's instructions, asked two brief clarifying questions, and agreed without further discussion. They watched Edgar Carver ride north in the thin gray light before sunrise, and Ada let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like months. "It's done," she said. "The sending of it is done," Martin said. "The rest takes time." She knew this. She had always known this. But standing on the edge of Caldwell in the cold October dawn with the documentation on its way to Topeka, and a man she had known for 12 hours standing next to her, she allowed herself to feel, for the first moment in a long time, that the thing she was doing might actually work. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," he said, "we face Holt. And we do it in the open, in front of witnesses, before he gets the chance to do something quiet and unobservable." "You mean before he tries to make us disappear?" "He won't do that. He's too careful for violence that obvious. What he'll do is try to discredit us, or buy us out, or find something we've done wrong that he can use as leverage." He paused. "Which is why I'm going to tell you the complete version of my history with him today. Before we walk back into his line of sight, you need to know every piece of it." This was not a comfortable conversation, and it took nearly an hour, and they had it in the early morning at a second table in Clara's diner over coffee that Clara brought without being asked, because she had seen people needing to talk through hard things, and knew the correct response was coffee and distance. Martin Yates had arrived in Kansas from Missouri in the spring of 1876, which placed him in the difficult and chaotic years following the end of the major cattle drive's first boom cycle, when the land economy of the state was being redrawn rapidly, and the people who understood the redrawn map were making fortunes, and the people who were slow to understand it were losing ground, sometimes literally. He had come with money from the sale of a Missouri property, enough to establish the homestead, and he had arrived already knowing Ezra Holt's name, because Holt had worked a version of the same scheme in Joplin, Missouri 2 years before, and Martin had been, as he had told her, on the periphery of it, had sold Holt a property that he had not known was part of a fraudulent chain. What he had not told her the night before, and what he told her now, was that the man who had originally defrauded that property was his own older brother, Samuel Yates, who had been running land schemes in Missouri for years before Holt had absorbed him into a larger operation, and that Samuel Yates was now, as far as Martin knew, either dead or disappeared, and that the guilt and complication of this was part of the weight Martin had been carrying when he arrived in Caldwell. Part of what made him careful, part of what made him quiet. "Your brother worked for Holt," Ada said carefully. "My brother was, initially, working independently. Holt absorbed his operation when it became convenient. Samuel had a gift for forgery that Holt found useful." Martin's voice was level and uninflected in the way of a man who has said a true and painful thing so many times that the pain has become structural rather than acute. "I did not know this until after the Joplin sale. When I found out, I confronted Samuel. He told me to stay out of it. 3 months later, he was gone." "Do you think Holt—" "I think Holt handles complications efficiently," Martin said. "I don't have proof. I have stopped needing it to function, but I have not stopped knowing it." Ada was quiet for a moment, feeling the full weight of what he was carrying, the not quite provable loss, the guilt by proximity, the 2 years of careful neutrality that was really 2 years of grief and rage held tightly in check. "I'm sorry about your brother," she said. "I'm sorry about your father," he said. They looked at each other across the table, and this time the silence had a different quality, warmer and more complicated, the silence of two people who have exchanged true things and found them equally weighted. "We are quite the pair to be taking on a corrupt sheriff," Ada said, and this time the not-quite laugh made it all the way out, and it was a real one, tired and wry and genuine, and she saw Martin Yates do something she suspected he did rarely. He smiled. It transformed his face in a way that was almost shocking, not because it was unexpected exactly, but because it revealed something that had been very carefully contained, something warm and specific and very much alive. And Ada felt the pull of it like a current in a river, the kind you don't notice until you realize you've moved without intending to. She looked back down at her coffee. "We should go talk to Judge Pemberton," she said, because she was practical and there were things to do, and because the alternative was sitting here feeling things that were not going to be useful until the immediate situation was resolved. Judge Abner Pemberton was the circuit judge who rotated through Caldwell every 6 weeks, and who was not, as far as Ada's research had indicated, in Holt's pocket, partly because he was a federal appointment, and partly because he had a reputation for the kind of personal rectitude that made him a poor target for bribery. He was due in Caldwell in 4 days, but Martin said he had heard he was already in town for a land dispute hearing that had come up early. They found Pemberton at the hotel, eating a late breakfast with the methodical concentration of a man who took his meals seriously. He looked at Martin Yates with the neutral recognition of someone who knew who he was and had formed no particular opinion, and he looked at Ada Brooks with the slightly more alert interest of a man who registered an unusual situation. Ada laid out the case. She was clear and organized and did not editorialize. She presented the documentation she had retained in logical sequence, explained the chain of evidence, named Martin as an additional witness with direct testimony. She spoke for 20 minutes without interruption and then waited. Pemberton had the kind of face that gave nothing away during its thinking, which was both a feature and a source of anxiety. He drank his coffee. He looked at the documents. He asked 6 pointed questions that Ada answered accurately. "This is," he said finally, "a substantial body of evidence against a sitting sheriff." "Yes," Ada said. "If it holds up under scrutiny, and I'm not saying it will, I'm saying if, then what you are describing is not merely land fraud but systematic abuse of official authority which moves this into federal jurisdiction. Which is why the full package is on its way to the commissioner's office in Topeka as of this morning," Ada said. Pemberton looked at her steadily. "You moved quickly." "I had reason to." He looked at Martin. "Yates, your testimony, you're willing to give it officially, understanding that it may involve full disclosure of your own earlier connection to Holt's operation in Missouri." "Yes," Martin said, simply and without hesitation. Pemberton was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'll need to examine these documents fully, and I'll need sworn affidavits before I can take any formal action. But I can issue a precautionary order restricting Holt from conducting any land transactions or executing any official warrants pending investigation, and I can do that today on the basis of what I've seen here." He folded his hands on the table. "Miss Brooks, this was professionally assembled. Your father would be proud." Ada had been holding herself together through sheer will for so long that this particular sentence, said in a matter-of-fact tone by a federal judge over a hotel breakfast, nearly undid her. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed very steadily and said, "Thank you." Martin's hand moved under the table and covered hers briefly, just for a moment, and then was gone, and Ada thought, "He knew I needed that." The next 2 days were the strangest of Ada's life, which was saying something given the previous 8 months. Holt received Pemberton's precautionary order on Sunday afternoon, and the response was exactly what Martin had predicted: careful, controlled, and tactical. Holt did not blustering or threaten openly. He sent a lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Fitch who had ridden up from the south of the county, to challenge the order's basis and to request a formal hearing. This was fine. A formal hearing was something Ada had documentation for. What was less fine was the specific piece of information Fitch introduced at the hearing request, which was the Missouri land transaction, Martin's name on the deed, and the implication that his testimony was self-interested and compromised by his own previous participation in exactly the kind of scheme he was now accusing Holt of running. Ada had known this was coming. Martin had known this was coming. They had prepared for it. It was still, when it arrived, a particular kind of cold. They were in Pemberton's improvised chambers, which was really just the hotel's private dining room cleared of its tablecloths, and Ada watched Martin sit very still while Fitch laid out the Missouri connection in precise, unflattering terms. And she thought about what it cost to sit like that while a true and complicated piece of your history was deployed as a weapon. When it was her turn, she said, Mr. Yates has disclosed the Missouri transaction fully, voluntarily, and in advance of this proceeding. The fact that he was unknowingly adjacent to a whole top-rated fraud chain in Missouri does not impeach his direct testimony regarding what he witnessed in this county. It establishes a pattern of Holt's behavior across multiple jurisdictions, which strengthens rather than weakens the overall case. Pemberton looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at his papers. Furthermore, Ada continued, the documentation from my father's estate and the sworn statements from 3 other former cooperative members, none of whom have any connection to any Missouri land transaction, are independently sufficient to establish the core fraud claims. Mr. Yates' testimony is corroborating, not foundational. Fitch said that he had more to present and asked for a continuance. Pemberton said he would take everything under advisement. Outside the hotel in the pale October sunshine, Ada and Martin stood on the boardwalk, and Martin looked at the empty street and said quietly, "You handled that very well." Fitch underestimated how much I'd thought through the vulnerabilities, Ada said. She paused. "How are you?" He looked at her, and there it was again, that quality of being seen clearly by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. "I've been better," he said, with an honesty that was more valuable than composure. "It's going to hold," she said. "The case is strong. Pemberton knows it." "I know," he said. "I'm not worried about the case." She thought she understood what he meant. The case was external and manageable. What Fitch had done was internal and personal, was the public assembly of a piece of Martin's history that contained his dead brother and his own complicity and 2 years of living carefully in the shadow of it. And having it laid out in a hotel dining room before a federal judge did not become easier just because you had prepared for it. They walked to Clara's diner, because it had become, in 48 hours, the place they went when things needed to be thought through, and Clara brought coffee and dried apple pie and left them alone. "Tell me something that isn't about Holt," Ada said, because she thought he needed it, and she was discovering, wanted it. He looked at her across the table with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, which was surprise, the kind that was genuinely felt rather than performed. "What would you like to know?" "Why wheat," she said. "Your homestead, most of the land around here is grazing." Something shifted in his face, a genuine animation that was different from the careful, measured engagement she'd been seeing. "Wheat is hard to grow here. The soil's wrong for it by half, and the rain is unpredictable. Everybody told me I was wasting my time." He paused. "My father grew wheat in Indiana. It's all I ever wanted to smell in the morning." Ada was quiet for a moment. "My father kept books in a way that was so methodical it was almost artistic," she said. "I didn't appreciate it when I was young. I thought it was just his job. When I found his letters and his records after he died, I understood that his books were the way he told the truth. Every entry was its own small act of honesty." She looked at her coffee cup. "I suppose that's what I've been doing for 8 months, writing his books for him." Martin looked at her for a long moment, and it was the kind of look that contained many things, recognition and admiration and something warmer underneath, and Ada felt it land in that place behind her sternum again, and this time she did not look away. "He would be glad," Martin said, "that you did." She thought she might cry, and she did not, but it was a near thing. On Monday, the response from Topeka arrived faster than anticipated, which suggested that Ada's pre-written letters to the commissioner's office and the reputation of Pemberton's name on the inquiry had moved things with unusual speed. The wire confirmed receipt of the documentation package, announced that a federal investigator was being dispatched from Topeka, and requested that all parties involved maintain their positions pending the investigators' arrival. Holt received a copy of this wire by official dispatch. Ada learned about his reaction secondhand through Mrs. Haverson, who had a remarkable intelligence network built on the social infrastructure of the boarding house trade. And what Mrs. Haverson reported was that Holt had been seen in the company of his lawyer and two of his deputies for several hours that afternoon, and that the general atmosphere in the sheriff's office was, in Mrs. Haverson's precise phrasing, like a pot that's been left too long on the fire. Ada suspected this was both accurate and slightly understated. On Tuesday morning, Fitch the lawyer sent a written request to Pemberton for a private meeting that excluded Ada and Martin, which Pemberton declined on the grounds that all parties with standing in the matter should be present for any procedural discussions. This refusal was, Ada believed, the moment that Holt fully understood the position he was in, because a man of his caliber would know the difference between a negotiable situation and a foreclosed one. What happened next was something none of them had quite predicted, though perhaps should have. Ezra Holt came to find Ada Brooks himself, not with his men, not in the saloon or in the sheriff's office or in any place of his choosing. He came to Clara's diner on Tuesday afternoon alone, and he was something that Ada had not imagined him being. He was scared. Not visibly, not in any way that someone who didn't know how to look would have seen. He sat down across from Ada, who was working through her notes for the third time, and he looked at her with the measured, calculating intelligence that had built his operation over 5 years. And underneath it, in the way that fear lives in the very precise set of the mouth, and the very particular way the hands lie still when they want to move, she saw it. Martin came in 20 seconds later, either by coincidence or because he had been watching, and he sat down next to Ada without asking and said nothing. Holt looked at them both. He said, "I understand that federal involvement is now in motion." "Yes," Ada said. "I want to discuss a resolution." "I'm not interested in a private resolution," Ada said. "What I'm offering," Holt said, and his voice had the careful flatness of a man who has decided honesty is currently the most useful instrument in his toolkit, is a full accounting. The documents, the land survey discrepancies, the forged debt instruments. I'm prepared to submit a complete disclosure to the federal investigator in exchange for consideration on the criminal charges. Ada looked at him. She was thinking very clearly, in the way she thought best, which was without emotion clouding the practical structure of what was actually being offered. "That's not my decision to make," she said. "That is the federal investigator's decision and the land commissioners and ultimately the territorial courts. What I can tell you is that the documentation I've provided is complete and accurate, and if a full accounting corroborates it, then the question of consideration for cooperation is one you'll need to raise with them." Holt was quiet for a moment. He looked at Martin. "Yates." Martin said nothing. "The Missouri matter," Holt said. "I have documentation that complicates your position." "I know," Martin said. "I've disclosed it already." Something in Holt's expression shifted, very slightly, into something that was almost respect, or possibly just the recognition of a play that had failed. He nodded once, a small, precise gesture, and stood up. "I will be speaking with Judge Pemberton tomorrow," he said. "I wanted you to know that what is coming through legal channels and not otherwise." "I appreciate the notice," Ada said. He left. Clara came out of the kitchen almost immediately with fresh coffee, which suggested she had been listening from the other side of the door with her ear pressed to the wood, and her expression as she refilled their cups was the specific combination of satisfaction and relief of someone who has watched a bully finally, meet something he can't move through. Martin sat next to Ada for a moment after Holt left and said nothing, but his shoulder was against hers in the narrow space of the diner, and she didn't move away, and after a moment he said, "You were extraordinary just now." "I was practical," she said. "Ada," he said gently, "that is the same thing." She felt the warmth of it move through her from the shoulder outward, and she thought, "This is a terrible time to be feeling what I'm feeling." And then she thought, When, exactly, would be a better one? The federal investigator arrived on Thursday, a composed and efficient man named Garrett from the commissioner's office, and the formal process that followed over the next 2 days was not dramatic in the way that courtroom scenes in penny novels are dramatic. It was meticulous and careful, and involved a great deal of documentation review and formal sworn testimony, and the kind of procedural precision that is, in its own way, its own form of justice. Holt did, as promised, provide a full accounting in exchange for the investigator's recommendation of reduced charges. The accounting was comprehensive and corroborated every element of Ada's documentation, and added several incidents she had not been aware of, including 2 other families whose land had been absorbed through the same forgery scheme, and who had not had an Ada Brooks to advocate for them. This part of the proceedings was the hardest, in some ways. Not the confrontations, not the legal maneuvering, but the quiet moment in the hearing when the full list of damaged parties was read aloud, and Ada thought about how many Thomas Brookses there had been, how many families who had lost something real and irreplaceable, how many people for whom there would never be complete redress. She said this to Martin that evening outside Clara's diner in the cold night air with the stars enormous over the Kansas plain, and he stood beside her and looked at the same sky and said, "You gave them something they didn't have before. You gave them a record, a true account. That matters even when it can't give back what was lost." She turned to look at him. He was looking up at the stars, and the cold air had put color in his face, and he was, she realized with the simple clarity of a thing that had been growing for days and could no longer be reasonably ignored, the most real person she had met in a very long time. "Martin," she said. He looked down at her. There were many things she could have said, and she thought through several of them in the space of a second and decided against all of them in favor of the plainest one, which was also the truest. "I'm glad you stood up in that saloon on Saturday night," she said. His expression did the thing it had done when he smiled, that brief, unguarded revelation of the warmth that he normally kept very carefully contained, and this time it stayed, didn't retreat, and he said, "I'm glad you walked into it." The moment stretched, and Caldwell breathed around them, and somewhere in the vast dark of the Kansas plain, a coyote called and was answered, and Ada Brooks stood in the cold October night and felt something she had not expected to feel and had not made room for in her plans and could not, now that it was there, imagine setting aside. He kissed her, or she kissed him. In the specific way of these things, it was genuinely unclear who moved first, but it was gentle and careful and brief, and when it ended they both stood very still for a moment, and she thought she heard his breath adjust, and he said, quietly, "Ada." "Yes," she said. "I have wanted to say something for 3 days and have been waiting until this was finished. It isn't quite finished yet." "Close enough," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her heart do a thing that hearts do when certainty arrives unannounced and finds you entirely ready. "Stay," he said, "not because the case needs you, not for any reason other than the plainest one. Stay." She looked at him for a long moment with everything she'd learned about him in 5 days laid out clearly in her mind. The weight he carried and the way he carried it. The wheat fields he grew in the wrong soil because they smelled like home. The way he sat alone at the corner table for 2 years. The way he had stood up without hesitation in a room full of enemies. The way he said her name like it was a thing he took seriously. "Ask me properly," she said. Something flashed across his face and the smile came back, fuller this time, and it was, she thought, possibly the most affecting thing she had seen in her 26 years. "Ada Brooks," he said, "will you stay in Caldwell?" "I will consider it," she said, and she was smiling too, and the October night was cold and enormous around them, and it was, in its own way, perfect. The formal conclusion of the investigation took another 2 weeks. Ezra Holt was removed from his position as sheriff of Caldwell pending the territorial court's review of the charges against him, which included fraud, forgery, abuse of official authority, and interference with federal land registry processes. Fitch the lawyer negotiated vigorously and reduced this to a settlement that included substantial financial restitution to the affected parties and Holt's permanent removal from any official position in the state of Kansas, which was not, perhaps, the full criminal accountability Ada had once hoped for, but was real and consequential and would stand. The restitution was partial. It was never going to be complete. Ada knew this, and she sat with the knowledge of it in the way of someone who has accepted the difference between what is possible and what is deserved, and she kept both things clear in her mind without letting either obscure the other. She wrote a long letter to her mother in St. Louis, who had not known the full shape of what Ada was doing, who had believed her daughter was visiting a cousin, who received this letter in November with what Ada could only imagine was a complicated mixture of horror and pride. Her mother's responding letter arrived 10 days later and contained, characteristically, exactly one sentence about the legal proceedings and 14 sentences about the young man who had been mentioned, somewhat in passing, in Ada's account. She read the letter twice and folded it carefully and told Martin about its contents over dinner at Clara's, and he listened with that particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered, and when she finished he said, "Would it be appropriate for me to write to her?" Ada looked at him across the table. "That depends on what you intend to write." He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the table between them, which was a ring plainly made from silver, with a small band of twisted wire that had been worked with enough care to be beautiful without being elaborate, and he said, "I made this last week. The wire is from a fence on the north pasture that your father originally helped me build a survey marker for, which means it comes from land that was always honestly claimed." He paused. "I thought that mattered." Ada looked at the ring and then at Martin, and the thing in her chest that had been loosening since the night in this same diner when he had told her she was the first person who had made his corner table feel less empty. That thing was entirely and completely free now, and she said, "It matters very much." "Ada Brooks," he said, "will you marry me? And I am asking properly this time." She picked up the ring and looked at it for a moment, at the careful twisted wire and the silver that had come from honestly claimed land, and she said, "Yes, Martin Yates, I will." He reached across the table and put the ring on her finger, and Clara appeared from the kitchen with a bottle of something considerably better than her usual coffee and said, "I've been waiting for this since Tuesday of last week," which explained the quality of the apple pie that had been appearing at their table without explanation for days. Ada wrote to her mother that evening, and the response, when it came, was warm and practical and included specific instructions about the appropriate fabric for a winter wedding in Kansas, which Ada read with a specific fond exasperation, and then followed almost entirely. They were married in December, in Caldwell's church on a cold Sunday morning with a sky the color of pewter, and a congregation that included Mrs. Haverson, who cried, Clara, who did not cry but looked like she might, Judge Pemberton, who had stayed in Caldwell longer than his circuit required for reasons he did not explain, and a considerable portion of the town, including several of the former cooperative members whose written testimony had helped make the case, and their families. Ada's mother came from St. Louis on the train, accompanied by Ada's aunt, and she met Martin for the first time at the rehearsal dinner at Clara's diner, which Clara had closed for the evening and decorated with every ribbon she owned, and she assessed him with the clear-eyed directness that Ada recognized as hereditary, and said, at the end of the evening, to Ada in the small quiet of the boarding-house room, "He carries himself like a man who knows what he's worth, not more and not less. Those are the ones you can trust." Ada thought this was the most perceptive thing she had ever heard her mother say, and her mother had said many perceptive things. The ceremony itself was simple and honest, the way the best ceremonies are, and when it was done and they stood in the cold December air outside the church, Martin took her hand in his and looked at her with those gray eyes that had become, over the course of these weeks, the most familiar sight she knew, and said, quietly, so only she could hear it, I am going to spend considerable time making sure you have no reason to regret staying. I have no intention of regretting it, she said. But the effort is appreciated. They went to the homestead, which Ada had first seen in November and had spent the intervening weeks learning, its particular geography and its rhythms, and the specific quality of its morning light. The farmhouse was modest and solid, built by Martin's own hands in the first year after he arrived, with a kitchen that faced east to catch the morning sun, and a front porch that faced south across the flat grass to where, on the clearest days, you could see the distant shimmer that might have been heat or might have been the edge of something larger. The wheat fields, which had been harvested in August and were now bare and brown and waiting for spring, spread out from the north side of the property with a particular quiet patience that Ada had come to love in the specific way you love things that are difficult and stubborn and ultimately worth it. She stood on the front porch in the December cold on their first evening as a married couple and looked out across the land, and Martin came to stand beside her with 2 cups of coffee and gave her one, and they stood there together in the cold and the dark and the silence of the plain, and it was entirely and completely enough. The winter was long and cold and required the specific practical competencies of frontier living that Ada did not have and learned quickly, because she was her father's daughter and Thomas Brooks had believed that practical knowledge was the foundation of everything worth having. She learned to judge weather from the behavior of the cattle and the particular quality of the western clouds. She learned to bake bread in a wood-fired oven that had moods. She learned the names and characters of every horse in Martin's stable, and she learned that the gray mare named Patience was the most intelligent animal she had ever met and would, if given the opportunity, open any gate in the county. Martin taught her these things with the patience and pleasure of a man who has been alone for a long time and finds great satisfaction in not being alone anymore. And Ada taught him things in return, not by design, but by the natural process of 2 people who are genuinely curious about each other and have decided to pay attention. And what emerged over the long winter months was the particular texture of a shared life, which is different from romance and different from partnership, and contains elements of both and is, in the end, its own distinct and irreplaceable thing. In February, Ada received a letter from the Federal Land Commissioner's office confirming that the restitution payments had been assessed and were being dispersed to the documented affected parties. Her father's estate would receive a portion that was not equivalent to what had been taken but was acknowledgement, which mattered in ways that money could not fully capture. She also received a letter from one of the former cooperative members, a man named Brennan who had lost 60 acres to Holt's scheme, who wrote to say that, with the restitution, he intended to buy back the eastern portion of his original holding, and that he wanted Ada to know that what she had done had given people back something beyond land, which was the understanding that they had not simply been unlucky but had been wronged, and that this distinction, which sounds small, was everything. She gave this letter to Martin to read, and he read it twice and handed it back and said, with that precise, unperformed honesty of his, "Your father would not have imagined that it would end like this. But I think he would have understood it." Ada thought about this for a while and then said, "He would have liked you." Martin considered. "I would have been determined to deserve it," he said. She leaned against him on the kitchen bench where they were reading their mail in the morning light, and he put his arm around her. And outside the kitchen window the February sky was pale and bright, and the wheat fields were still bare but beginning, if you looked closely enough, to show the faintest possible suggestion of the green that was coming. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way it does on the plains, and with it came the specific miracle that Martin waited for every year with the focused hope of a man who has learned to find his religion in practical things. The wheat came in. It came in better than any previous year. The combination of a wet autumn and a cold winter, and the particular care that Ada's presence seemed to have catalyzed in ways that were not entirely explicable. And on the morning in May, when they walked the north field together, and the wheat was knee-high, and the light was gold, and the Kansas sky was doing what the Kansas sky does when it decides to be magnificent. Martin Yates stopped in the middle of the field and looked at his wife standing in the wheat in the morning light and said nothing for a long moment, just looked. "What?" Ada said. "I'm just looking," he said. "I don't want to miss it." She understood this. She had been doing the same thing all spring, cataloging the specific textures of this life, storing them with the same care her father had given to his books, because some things are worth writing down even if only in the part of your memory that keeps the things that matter. In June, Ada told Martin she was expecting their first child, which she had suspected for 2 weeks and confirmed with the doctor, and Martin received this information in a way that was entirely characteristic, which was a long, quiet moment, and then a series of very practical questions about her health and the doctor's assessment and what they would need to prepare. And then, when she had answered all of them, he took her face in both his hands and looked at her with those gray eyes in which she could read everything he felt, and said, "Ada," in the specific tone that meant, "You have given me something I did not know I was allowed to have." The baby was born in March of the following year, 1880, which was a hard winter and a cold spring and a labor that was long and difficult, and attended by the doctor from town and Mrs. Haverson, who arrived unbidden with hot water and absolute competence and stayed for 3 days. It was a boy, which made Martin's face do something so thoroughly undone and unguarded that Ada, who was exhausted and proud and in some pain, laughed when she saw it. "You look terrified," she said. "I am," he said. "You can hold him." Martin held his son with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided that the most important thing he will ever handle requires his absolute attention, and the baby, who was red and furious about the world in the way of all new arrivals, seemed to find something to object to slightly less strenuously once he was in those particular hands, and gradually settled into a watchful quiet. "Thomas," Ada said. "I'd like to call him Thomas." Martin looked at her and then at the baby and then back at her. "Thomas Martin Yates," he said. "Yes," she said, "that." The spring of 1880 was its own particular grace. Thomas Yates was a baby who viewed the world with the alert, considering attention of someone who intended to understand it thoroughly, which Ada suspected was hereditary from at least 2 directions, and the homestead adjusted around his presence with the organic accommodation of a living thing making room for more life. There was a conversation that spring, on the front porch in the April evening when Thomas was asleep, and the sky was the deep blue of the hour before full dark, that Ada kept afterward in the part of her memory reserved for the things that mattered most. She had been thinking about her father, which she did often, differently now than she had before, the grief still present but changed in its quality, deeper and less acute, the way a scar changes from wound to mark. "Do you think he knew," she said, "that it would be resolved?" Martin was quiet for a moment. "I think he knew that you were the kind of person who would try to resolve it," he said. "I think that knowledge probably gave him something important." "He didn't protect himself well enough," Ada said, and this was the thing she had been carrying that still had edges. "He was too trusting." "Some people are," Martin said. "It's not a flaw, it's how he was built." "The world needs people built that way, even when it's dangerous to be one." She thought about this. "Is that how you see it?" "I see it as something that requires people built differently to protect," he said. "People built for noticing." Ada looked at him. "Is that what you are?" "I don't know what I am precisely," he said. "I know that I notice things, and I know that for 2 years I noticed everything in Caldwell without doing anything about most of it, and I am going to spend considerable time being grateful that you walked into that saloon before I had talked myself out of caring." "You hadn't talked yourself out of caring," Ada said. "That was clear the moment you stood up." He was quiet. Then, "The table," he said. "What?" "When I told you that you were the first person who had made my table feel less empty, I meant it as a specific thing, not a general one. That corner of that saloon was where I sat for 2 years and practiced the discipline of not feeling things loudly enough that they would require action. He paused. And then you were there, and the discipline became something I had no interest in anymore. Ada was quiet for a moment, listening to the evening settle, listening to the distant cattle and the near sound of the sleeping baby through the open window, and the absolute vast quiet of the Kansas plain all around them. "I have been thinking," she said, "about staying permanently." "You are permanently here," he said. "You're my wife. I mean not just here, I mean Caldwell specifically, the cooperative that my father helped build, the other families trying to hold on to their land." She paused. "There's work to do that doesn't end with Holt. The structures that let someone like Holt happen, the land registry system, the circuit court delays, the way isolated homesteaders have no collective legal standing. I know how to do this kind of work." Martin looked at her in the evening light with the expression she knew best on him, the one that combined precision and warmth in the specific proportion of a man who has learned to feel things clearly without letting feeling obscure clarity. "I know you do," he said. "I was wondering when you'd get to it." She turned to look at him. "You were waiting." "I was giving you time to breathe," he said. "You'd been running for 8 months before I met you. I thought you deserved a spring." She felt something that was too large and too real for a single word, the accumulated weight of the previous 2 years, and the gift of being known completely, and the specific grace of a man who gave space and paid attention and held his son like the most important thing he'd ever held. And she said, "Martin Yates," in the tone that meant, "I'm trying to tell you something that the language does not have precise enough instruments for." "Ada Yates," he said, in the same tone, meaning the same thing. They sat on the porch as the dark came fully in, and the stars emerged over the Kansas plain with their customary extravagance. And somewhere in the house, Thomas slept with the focused determination of the recently born, and the wheat fields lay dark and growing to the north, and the future was wide and real and fully theirs. That summer, Ada began the process of reconstituting something like the original cooperative, working with Brennan and 3 other former members and 2 newer homesteaders who had come to Caldwell in the year since Holt's removal, and needed exactly the kind of collective legal framework that had not existed before. She wrote letters and attended meetings, and rode out to remote homesteads on horseback with Thomas strapped to her, in a way that the baby found entirely agreeable, and the horse found philosophically challenging. And she built something that was more durable and better structured than what had existed before, with formal documentation and legal standing, and the specific protections against land fraud that experience had taught her were necessary. Martin participated in this with the particular practical competence of a man who knew the land, knew the measurements, knew the legal language of surveys and deeds. He was, Ada discovered, an extremely effective advocate when he chose to be, which he had not chosen for 2 years because the circumstances had not been right, and which he now chose freely and consistently, with none of the careful neutrality that had previously governed him. Judge Pemberton, who remained on a semi-permanent basis in Caldwell for reasons he continued not to explain, but which everyone understood had to do with the fact that Caldwell's legal landscape had become considerably more interesting than most of his circuit, was a formal ally and a quiet friend, and he and Martin and Ada constituted an informal but effective network that over the following 2 years challenged 3 additional fraudulent land claims in the county, and won 2 of them outright. This was the work. It was not dramatic in the way the Broken Spur confrontation had been dramatic. It was consistent and careful, and built on the kind of documentation that Ada had learned from her father's books, the understanding that truth recorded precisely is truth that can be defended, and it mattered in the specific real way of things that change the conditions of people's lives. In the winter of 1882, Ada discovered she was expecting again. This one came easier and faster than Thomas, arriving on a cold January morning just after dawn in a berth that was attended, again, by the doctor and Mrs. Haverson, and also, this time, by Clara, who had decided that attendance at the Yates family births was a standing commitment and would not hear otherwise. A girl this time. Ada and Martin had discussed names at length and without resolution, which was a characteristic quality of their discussions on matters where both had strong and well-reasoned opinions, and arrived at an agreement the night before the birth in that particular way of decisions reached through a combination of mutual respect and exhaustion. Eleanor Brooks Yates, the Brooks for the record and the memory, and Eleanor because it had been Martin's grandmother's name, and he had mentioned it once in passing, and Ada had held it in the back of her mind for 3 months without saying anything, and then brought it out fully formed. Eleanor arrived in January and immediately demonstrated a temperament that was her own, alert and determined and entirely unimpressed by the cold, and Martin held her the way he'd held Thomas, with the absolute focused care of a man who understood the weight of the thing in his hands, and said, "Hello," to her directly and quietly, and Eleanor looked at him with the considering gaze of the recently arrived, and seemed to decide he was acceptable. Thomas, who was nearly 3 and had the fully formed opinions of someone who has spent considerable time observing the world and drawing conclusions, examined his sister with scientific interest and announced that she was smaller than expected and could she be returned and exchanged for a horse. Ada looked at Martin. Martin looked at Ada. They looked at their son. "She stays," Martin said. "You'll be glad of her later." Thomas considered this information, and, with the pragmatic acceptance of someone who has learned that adults generally know things, filed it in his mind for future reference. The spring of 1882 brought 2 things. Eleanor's first real smile, which arrived in March and rendered everyone in the household temporarily incapable of ordinary function, and the completion of the cooperative's first formal legal document, a jointly held land use agreement with collective legal standing that had taken Ada 18 months of careful work and several trips to Topeka, and the specific sustained advocacy of a person who understood that the most important things take the time they take. Brennan said at the signing that he had talked to his wife about what it had meant, and that his wife had said to tell Ada that the land they were working now, the 60 acres they'd bought back, felt different than it had before. Not the land itself. The feeling of it. Ada understood this. The feeling of honestly held land. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about a corner table in a Caldwell saloon, warped from years of spilled whiskey, with a guttering candle that blew out every time the door opened, and a man who sat there alone for 2 years practicing the discipline of not feeling things, and the particular grace of standing in the right place at the right moment when someone walked in who needed you to stand up. You are the first person who has sat at this table and made it feel less empty. She had thought about this sentence many times over the previous 4 years. It had seemed, when he said it, like a statement about a table in a diner. She understood now that it was a statement about something larger and more essential, about the particular human capacity to be changed by presence, to find that the spaces you have occupied alone are revealed by the arrival of the right person, to have been waiting all along. She was, Ada Brooks Yates thought, on the front porch of her home in the May evening with her husband beside her and her son running circles in the yard and her daughter asleep in the house, and the wheat coming into the north and the Kansas sky putting on its best display. She was, precisely and completely, where she was supposed to be. Martin reached over without looking and took her hand, and she felt the worn silver of the ring against her finger, the wire from the honestly claimed land, and she held his hand and watched Thomas chase a butterfly across the yard with the dedicated absurdity of a 2-year-old who believes catching one is not only possible but imminent, and she thought, "My father would have sat on this porch, and he would have loved this, and he would have been right." "What are you thinking?" Martin asked. "That this is enough," she said. "More than enough." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When I was sitting in that corner of the broken spur on all those Friday nights I used to watch the door." "For what?" "I didn't know," he said. "That was the thing. I didn't know what I was watching for, only that I was watching." He paused, and then the door opened and you walked in with a gun on the table and a truth you'd been carrying for 8 months, and I understood. She turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with the fullness of a man who has learned, over years and through difficulty, that it is possible to be exactly where you are meant to be. And she thought, here we are, both of us, fully arrived. I'm glad the door opened, she said. So am I, he said. Every day. Thomas caught the butterfly briefly and released it and watched it go with a satisfaction that required no further achievement. Alina stirred inside and made the sound that meant she would be hungry soon. The wheat grew in the long light of the Kansas evening, and the plain spread out in every direction with its particular boundless patience. And Ada and Martin Yates sat on their front porch in the spring of 1882 and held on to each other and to everything they had built together, from the ruins of old secrets and old wrongs, and the particular courage of walking through the right door at the right moment and being willing to stand up. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in every sense that mattered, everything.